The shattering glass and terrified screams propelled me out of bed and down the stairs, my heart pounding. In the hallway, I froze at the sight before me. Thomas, my son-in-law, gripping a bloodied baseball bat, his face contorted with rage. Rachel, my daughter, lay crumpled on the floor, her sobs echoing off the walls. "What have you done?" I screamed, rushing to Rachel's side. Her face was already swelling, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Thomas sneered, his eyes wild. "She's my wife. I'll do what I want with her." He raised the bat menacingly. "Stay out of this, Diane." I positioned myself between him and Rachel. "Get out. Now. Before I call the police." My voice shook, but I held his gaze. With a final glare, Thomas stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I knelt beside Rachel, cradling her as she wept. "I'm taking you to the hospital. It's going to be okay, sweetheart." But as I helped her to the car, I couldn't shake the icy dread settling in my stomach. I'd seen the look in Thomas's eyes. This was only the beginning. At the hospital, I paced the waiting room, my mind reeling. How had it come to this? When Rachel first brought Thomas home, he'd seemed like a dream, charming, attentive, doting on her and Caleb. But as the years passed, that perfect facade cracked, revealing something darker underneath. The controlling behavior, the explosive anger. Rachel always made excuses, convinced she could fix him. Until tonight. Seeing my daughter battered and broken, I knew I had to act. I couldn't lose Rachel like I'd lost my husband. Memories of his casket being lowered into the ground flashed through my mind. No, I refused to bury my child too. "Mrs. Wilkins?" A doctor emerged, his face grave. "Your daughter has a severe concussion and multiple contusions. She'll need to stay for observation." I nodded numbly, bile rising in my throat. "Can I see her?" He led me to her room where Rachel lay pale and still, a bandage stark white against her hair. Rage burned in my chest, hardening into resolve. I wouldn't let Thomas near her again. No matter what it took. Caleb. The thought hit me like a freight train. He was still at home with the babysitter, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding. I had to get back to him. "I'll be back soon," I whispered to Rachel's unconscious form. "I promise." Driving home, I gripped the steering wheel, a plan taking shape. First, a restraining order. Then security cameras, new locks, a baseball bat of my own if needed. I'd turn the house into a fortress Thomas couldn't breach. But even as I plotted, a small voice whispered that it wouldn't be enough. That Thomas's obsession ran too deep. A shudder ran through me. Pulling into the driveway, I took a deep breath and composed myself. I had to be strong for Caleb. Entering the house, I found him on the couch, his small face pinched with worry. "Grandma, where's Mommy?" I sat beside him, pulling him into a hug. "She had an accident, but she's going to be okay." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. "I need you to be brave, okay, buddy?" He nodded against my chest, but I felt the first of many questions forming, questions I wasn't ready to answer. Holding him tighter, I closed my eyes. "God, give me strength," I prayed. The battle was only beginning. The hospital corridors felt endless as I made my way to Rachel's room, the sterile smell burning my nostrils. I'd left Caleb with my sister, promising I'd be back soon. But the sight of Rachel lying motionless, her face a patchwork of purple bruises, made me wonder how long soon would be. A soft knock made me turn. Officer Davis stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Mrs. Wilkins, I need to speak with you." In the hallway, he flipped open his notepad. "We've arrested Thomas for domestic battery, but given the severity of Rachel's injuries, he'll likely make bail." My stomach dropped. "What? He nearly killed her." "I understand your frustration. That's why I strongly advise you to file a restraining order." I nodded, a bitter laugh escaping me, as if a piece of paper could stop Thomas's rage. But I'd do whatever it took to keep him away from Rachel and Caleb. The next few days passed in a blur of police stations and courtrooms. The restraining order was granted, but it did little to ease the knot of fear in my chest. Rachel remained in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness. It was during one of these visits that I first noticed it, a figure lurking in the parking lot watching me. A chill ran down my spine. "Thomas," I marched outside, my hands balled into fists. "What the hell are you doing here? You know you can't be within 500 feet of Rachel." Thomas sneered, his eyes bloodshot. "She's my wife. You can't keep me from her. Or my son." "Caleb isn't your son anymore. Not after what you did. You poisoned them against me," he roared, spit flying from his mouth. "You turned my own family against me." I stepped closer, my voice low and fierce. You did that yourself. Now leave before I call the police. With a final glare, he turned and stalked away. But I knew it wasn't over. Thomas's obsession ran too deep. My fears were confirmed when I brought Rachel home. She was a ghost of herself, jumping at every noise, rarely leaving her room. And Caleb, my sweet grandson, retreated into himself, his once bright smile dimmed. But it was the small things that made my skin crawl. Caleb's favorite stuffed animal going missing. A kitchen window I swore I'd locked found open. I knew it was Thomas, violating the restraining order, invading our home like a cancer. I installed security cameras, changed the locks, but still, the violations continued. I'd catch glimpses of Thomas watching the house, his eyes hungry. Rachel grew more fearful by the day. I can't do this anymore, Mom, she whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared all the time. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I held her as she sobbed, my own eyes burning. We'll get through this, sweetheart. I won't let him hurt you again. But the next day, I found Caleb's backpack on the front lawn, the contents strewn across the grass. A note was tucked inside, scrawled in Thomas's jagged handwriting. I'm coming for my son. You can't stop me. Rage ignited in my veins. Enough was enough. I dialed Officer Davis with shaking fingers. I need you to arrest Thomas. He's violating the restraining order, stalking us. I'm afraid of what he'll do next. I'll send a patrol car right away. I watched from the window as Thomas was handcuffed and shoved into the police car, screaming obscenities. But even as relief washed over me, I knew this was just a temporary reprieve. Thomas was too far gone, consumed by his twisted desires. He'd stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and I'd stop at nothing to protect my family. The days following Thomas's arrest were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Rachel barely left her room, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. Caleb clung to me, his small face etched with a fear no child should know. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking meals, helping with homework, but the specter of Thomas loomed over us, a constant threat. It was a week later when I first saw him. I was walking Caleb home from school, my hand gripping his tightly, when I felt the prickle of eyes on my back. Turning, I spotted Thomas across the street, partially obscured by a tree. Our eyes locked, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. I hurried Caleb inside, my heart pounding. But the stalking only escalated from there. Thomas seemed to be everywhere, lurking outside the grocery store, parked down the block, watching from the shadows, always just far enough away to avoid violating the restraining order. Rachel grew more paranoid by the day. I can't take this anymore, Mom, she whispered, her hands trembling. I feel like I'm suffocating. I squeezed her shoulder, trying to project a strength I didn't feel. We'll get through this, honey. I won't let him hurt you again. But the next morning, I found Rachel's tires slashed, shards of rubber strewn across the driveway. White-hot rage surged through me. I stormed down the block to where Thomas lounged in his car, looking smug. I know it was you, I hissed, slamming my hands on the hood. Leave us alone, or I swear to God. Thomas leaned out the window, his face twisted with contempt. Or what, Diane? You'll sick the cops on me again? We both know how well that worked out. You're sick, Thomas. You need help. The only thing I need is my family, my son. His eyes glittered with a manic fervor, and I'll get him back no matter what it takes. I recoiled, my stomach churning. Caleb isn't yours. Not anymore. Thomas's smile turned cold. We'll see about that. I walked away on shaking legs, his laughter echoing behind me. This had to end. But how? The police were useless, the restraining order just a flimsy piece of paper. I felt like I was drowning, helpless against the tide of Thomas's obsession. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Rachel's sobs drifted from down the hall, each one like a knife to my heart. I couldn't take this anymore. I couldn't watch my daughter live in fear, my grandson's innocence shattered. In the darkness, a plan began to take shape, a desperate, dangerous plan. The next morning, I installed new deadbolts on all the doors, cameras at every angle of the house, a security system with an alarm that would wake the dead. If Thomas wanted to get inside, he'd have to go through Fort Knox. But even as I fortified our defenses, I knew it was only a matter of time before Thomas escalated. He was unraveling, his obsession consuming him like a cancer. I had to be ready. I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside my bed, took self-defense classes at the local gym, Anything to feel less helpless, less afraid. But the fear never left, a constant hum beneath my skin. I saw Thomas in every shadow, every creak of the house settling. I jumped at car alarms, my heart racing at the sight of any tall, dark-haired man. I was losing myself, piece by piece, but I couldn't let Rachel and Caleb see. I had to be strong for them, had to hold our crumbling world together with sheer force of will. Late one night, I found Rachel in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea. "I can't do this, Mom," she whispered. "I can't live like this anymore." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as she shook. "We'll find a way, honey, I promise." But as I held my broken daughter, I wasn't sure I believed my own words. Thomas's obsession was a monster, devouring us all, and I was terrified it would consume us whole. The security cameras blinked red in the darkness, a silent sentry against the night. But even their watchful gaze couldn't ease the dread coiled in my stomach. Every shadow seemed to hold Thomas's leering face, every creak of the floorboards his footsteps. I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of coffee when Rachel stumbled in, her eyes haunted. "Mom, have you seen Caleb's teddy bear? The one Dad gave him before he died?" I frowned, a chill running down my spine. "No, honey. Isn't it in his room?" "I've looked everywhere. It's just gone." A sickening realization dawned. Thomas, he'd been in the house. Bile rose in my throat as I raced upstairs, tearing through Caleb's room. Drawers hung open, toys scattered, but the bear was nowhere to be found. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice shaking with rage. Officer Davis arrived within minutes, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "I'll file a report, but without proof it was Thomas." "Who else would take Caleb's bear?" I snapped. "He's escalating! You have to do something!" Davis sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, keep your doors locked. If you see Thomas, call us immediately." But locking the doors felt like putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. Thomas was a virus, infecting every aspect of our lives. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I jumped at every noise, my heart slamming against my ribs, and then the emails started. They poured into Rachel's inbox, each one more disturbing than the last. "I miss you, baby. I miss our family. I just want to be with you and Caleb again. You can't keep me from my son. He needs his father. I'll do whatever it takes to get him back." "This is all your fault, Rachel. You and your mother. You turned Caleb against me. But I'll make you pay. I'll make you all pay." Rachel dissolved into tears as she read them, her shoulders shaking. I held her, my own eyes burning with helpless fury. "That's it," I said, my voice like steel. "I'm ending this. Now." I stormed to the police station, the emails clutched in my fist. I slammed them down on Officer Davis's desk, my hands trembling. "Arrest him. Now. These are clear violations of the restraining order." Davis scanned the emails, his face darkening. "You're right, Mrs. Wilkins. This is grounds for arrest." I watched, a grim satisfaction burning in my chest as Thomas was led out of his house in handcuffs, spitting and cursing. But even as the police car drove away, I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Thomas was too far gone, his obsession a cancer that had consumed him whole. Prison wouldn't stop him. Nothing would. I returned home to find Rachel curled on the couch, her face pale and drawn. Caleb sat beside her, clutching a framed photo of his father. My heart cracked at the sight. "Is it over?" Rachel whispered. "Is he gone?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to promise her that the nightmare was finally ending. But I couldn't lie. Not anymore. "For now," I said softly. "But we have to be prepared. Thomas, he's not going to stop. Not until he gets what he wants." Rachel closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "What are we going to do, Mom?" I knelt before her, taking her hands in mine. "We're going to fight, honey. We're going to do whatever it takes to keep our family safe." But even as I spoke the words, I felt a flicker of doubt. Thomas's obsession was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, and I was terrified we were about to be burned alive. The days after Thomas's arrest were a blur of police statements and hushed phone calls with lawyers. Rachel moved through the house like a ghost, jumping at every creak, every shadow. Caleb clung to me, his small face pinched with a fear no child should know. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking meals, reading bedtime stories, but the specter of Thomas loomed over us, a constant, suffocating presence. It was a week later when the first letter arrived. Rachel found it in the mailbox, her name scrawled across the envelope in Thomas's jagged handwriting. Her face paled as she read it, her hands shaking. "What does it say?" I asked, my heart in my throat. He says he loves me, that he forgives me for putting him in jail, that he knows we'll be a family again soon. I snatched the letter from her hands, scanning the rambling, delusional words. Rage ignited in my veins. Even from behind bars, Thomas was tormenting us. The letters kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Thomas professed his undying love for Rachel, his obsession with being a real father to Caleb. He blamed me for turning them against him, vowing revenge. I called Officer Davis, my voice shaking with fury. "You have to stop these letters. He's harassing us from jail." Davis sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilkins, but there's not much we can do. He has a right to send mail." I slammed the phone down, hot tears pricking my eyes. The system was failing us. Thomas was winning, even locked away. Rachel grew more withdrawn, spending hours staring blankly at the walls. She flinched when I touched her, lost in some dark memory. It was like watching my vibrant, beautiful daughter fade away before my eyes. Caleb, too, was slipping away. He woke screaming from nightmares, crying for the father he'd lost long before Thomas's arrest. My heart shattered as I held him, whispering hollow reassurances. "I want Daddy," he sobbed into my shoulder. "I want things to go back to how they were." I stroked his hair, blinking back my own tears. "I know, baby." But there was no going back. Thomas had shattered our world like a hammer through glass. All I could do was try to hold the jagged pieces together. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday. Rachel had ventured out to the store, a rare moment of normalcy, but she returned ashen-faced, a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice raw. "Look." It was a crayon drawing, crude but unmistakable. 3 stick figures, Rachel, Caleb, and Thomas, smiling together under a yellow sun. Scrawled beneath in a child's handwriting, "I miss you, Daddy." Caleb drew it. For Thomas, he gave it to a guard at the jail. I stared at the drawing, horror and fury rising like bile in my throat. Thomas was manipulating Caleb, poisoning him against us, using a child's love to fuel his twisted obsession. "This ends now," I said, my voice like steel. "I won't let him destroy Caleb, too." That night, I lay awake, a plan forming in my mind, a desperate, dangerous plan. I would confront Thomas in jail, look him in the eye, and make him see the monster he'd become. Make him leave us alone, once and for all. In the morning, I kissed a sleeping Rachel and Caleb goodbye, my heart heavy. "I love you," I whispered. "I'm gonna fix this. I promise." The drive to the jail was a blur, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I was buzzed through security, led to a small, cold room, and then there he was, Thomas, smirking at me through the plexiglass. Well, if it isn't the Wicked Witch herself. I leaned forward, my voice low and fierce. "Listen to me, you son of a bitch. I won't let you destroy my family, not anymore." Thomas's eyes glittered with malice. "They're my family, Diane, mine, and I'll never stop fighting for them. Not until my last breath." A chill ran down my spine at the unhinged conviction in his voice. I realized with sickening clarity that no threat, no plea, would stop him. He would hunt us until the day he died. Unless I stopped him first. I jolted awake to the sound of shattering glass. For a moment I lay frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Then a scream pierced the night. Rachel. I leapt from bed, grabbing the baseball bat I now kept beside me. I raced down the hall to Rachel's room, adrenaline surging through my veins. Please, God, let her be okay. I burst through the door to find Rachel cowering in the corner, her face white with terror. And there, standing over her with a jagged shard of glass, was Thomas. "Get away from her," I snarled, raising the bat. Thomas turned, his eyes wild. "Diane, so nice of you to join us." His voice was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the madness in his gaze. How did you get out?" My voice shook, fear and fury warring in my chest. "You think a little jail cell can hold me? I told you, Diane, I'll never stop fighting for my family." Behind him, Rachel let out a choked sob. Thomas whirled, pressing the glass to her throat. A bead of blood welled beneath the jagged edge. "One more step and I'll slit her pretty neck." I froze, my heart in my throat. "Thomas, please. You're sick. You need help." "The only thing I need is my wife and son, and you're going to give them to me." "Mommy?" Caleb's terrified voice made my blood run cold. He stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and glassy. Thomas's face split into a grotesque smile. "Caleb, come to Daddy." "Don't you dare," I hissed. But Caleb, innocent, trusting Caleb, took a tentative step forward. In a flash, Thomas grabbed him, yanking him close. Caleb yelped in fear, tears streaming down his face. There, buddy. Daddy's got you. Thomas's voice was a mockery of comfort, his grip on Caleb bruising. Let him go, Thomas. He's just a child. He's my child, Thomas roared. You took him from me, turned him against me, but that ends now. He began to back towards the door, dragging Caleb with him. Rachel let out a wail, lunging forward, but Thomas kicked her savagely, sending her crumpling. We're leaving, and if either of you try to stop me, I'll kill him. I swear I will. The world narrowed to a single point, my grandson's terrified face. I couldn't let Thomas take him. Couldn't let that monster destroy the last shred of innocence in Caleb's life. I met Thomas's crazed eyes, my grip tightening on the bat. You're not taking him anywhere. With a roar, I swung. The bat connected with Thomas's skull with a sickening crack. He staggered, his grip on Caleb loosening. I swung again, blind with rage. Thomas crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. Caleb scrambled free, running to Rachel's arms. For a long moment, the only sound was their muffled sobs. I stood over Thomas's motionless body, the bat slipping from my numb fingers. I'd done it. I'd stopped him, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence that had brought us here. Mom? Rachel's voice was small, broken. I turned to see her cradling Caleb, tears streaking her face. Is he? I knelt beside Thomas, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and thready. Part of me, the dark, vengeful part, whispered to finish the job. To end the monster who had shattered our lives. But I couldn't. I wouldn't let Thomas make me a monster too. Call 911, I said, my voice leaden. He's alive. For now. The police came, an ambulance in tow. I watched numbly as they loaded Thomas onto a stretcher, his face a bloody ruin. Officer Davis took my statement, his face grim. You did what you had to, Mrs. Wilkins. You protected your family. But had I? As I held Rachel and Caleb, their tears soaking my shirt, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. Thomas would live. He would heal. And his obsession, his sickness, that would fester, growing more twisted with each passing day. He would come for us again. I knew it in my bones, and next time I wouldn't hesitate to do what needed to be done. The hospital room was cold, the beeping of machines the only sound. I sat beside Thomas's bed, staring at his battered face. Even in unconsciousness, he looked menacing, his features twisted with hatred. Why, Thomas? I whispered. Why couldn't you just let us go? But I knew the answer. Thomas's obsession was a cancer, consuming him from the inside out. He would never stop. Not until he had what he wanted, or until he was dead. The thought chilled me, but I couldn't shake it. Thomas was a rabid dog, foaming at the mouth, and there was only one way to deal with a rabid dog. I was jolted from my dark musings by a commotion in the hallway. Shouts, the pounding of feet. I leapt up just as Caleb burst into the room, his face streaked with tears. Caleb, what are you doing here? Where's your mom? He has her, Grandma, Caleb sobbed, throwing himself into my arms. The bad man has Mommy. Ice flooded my veins. I whirled to see Thomas's bed empty, the machines shrieking in alarm. He was gone, and he had Rachel. I raced into the hallway, dragging Caleb with me. Help! Someone help! Nurses came running, their faces tight with concern. I babbled out an explanation, my heart slamming against my ribs. They called the police, put the hospital on lockdown. But it was too late. Thomas and Rachel were nowhere to be found. I paced the waiting room, my mind reeling. How could this happen? How could Thomas have escaped, taken Rachel, right under our noses? Officer Davis arrived, his face grim. We're doing everything we can to find them, Mrs. Wilkins. We have roadblocks set up, every available officer searching. He's going to kill her, I whispered, my voice breaking. He's going to kill my baby. Davis gripped my shoulder, his eyes fierce. We won't let that happen, I promise you. But promises meant nothing in the face of Thomas's madness. I knew, with sickening certainty, that he wouldn't stop until Rachel was dead, until we all were, unless I stopped him first. I turned to Davis, my jaw set. I need your help. I need a gun. Davis blinked, taken aback. Mrs. Wilkins, I can't just give you a gun. Then I'll get one myself, but one way or another I'm ending this, tonight. I left Davis sputtering, Caleb in tow. I dropped him at my sister's, ignoring her worried questions. Then I drove to the one place I knew Thomas would take Rachel, the one place that held meaning for him, their old house, the house where he'd shattered her, again and again. I parked down the block, my heart in my throat. The windows were dark, the street silent. But I knew they were in there. I could feel it. I crept around the back, my hand clutching the gun I'd bought off the streets. It felt heavy, alien in my grip. But I pushed down my revulsion. This was the only way. The back door was unlocked. I slipped inside, my breath shallow. The house was dark, the air thick with the stench of fear. A muffled cry made my heart stop. Rachel. I followed the sound, my finger on the trigger. It led me to the bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I peered through the crack, bile rising in my throat. Rachel was tied to the bed, her face battered and streaked with tears. Thomas loomed over her, a gun in his hand. "You're mine, Rachel. Forever. And if I can't have you, no one can." He raised the gun, aiming at her head. Rachel let out a wail, straining against her bonds. I burst through the door, my own gun leveled at Thomas. "Drop it, now." Thomas whirled, his eyes wild. You just couldn't let us be happy, could you?" "This isn't happiness, Thomas. This is sickness. Now let her go." Thomas laughed, a sound like shattered glass. "Oh, I'll let her go all right. Straight to hell." He turned back to Rachel, his finger tightening on the trigger. I fired, the shot deafening in the small room. Thomas staggered, his gun clattering to the floor. He looked down at the blooming red stain on his chest, then back at me, his face slack with shock. You shot me." I kept my gun trained on him, my voice like steel. "I warned you, Thomas. I warned you what would happen if you touched my family again." Thomas stumbled forward, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. For a long moment, the only sound was Rachel's muffled sobs. Then sirens split the air, red and blue light strobing through the windows. I untied Rachel with shaking hands, pulling her into my arms. She clung to me, her whole body trembling. "It's over, baby. It's finally over." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The nightmare Thomas had brought into our lives would never really end. We would carry the scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of our days. But we would carry them together, a family, unbroken. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The hospital room was a stark contrast to the chaos of that night. The beeping machines, the sterile white walls, it was almost peaceful. But the sight of Rachel, bruised and broken in the bed, shattered any illusion of peace. I sat beside her, holding her hand as she slept. The doctor said she would heal, physically at least. But the emotional scars, the trauma Thomas had inflicted, that would take longer, maybe a lifetime. Officer Davis knocked softly on the door, his face somber. "Mrs. Wilkins, can I speak with you?" In the hallway, he handed me a cup of coffee, his eyes tired. "Thomas is in surgery. The doctors say he'll likely pull through." I closed my eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. "What happens now?" "Well, he'll be arrested, charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, a whole host of things. He's looking at serious time." "Good." My voice was hard, unyielding. "I hope he rots in prison for the rest of his miserable life." Davis nodded, sipping his coffee. "There's something else. Your shooting of Thomas, it's been ruled self-defense. You won't face any charges." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Thank you for everything." Davis squeezed my shoulder, a small smile on his face. "You did what you had to, Mrs. Wilkins. You saved your daughter's life." But had I? As I watched Rachel sleep, her face pinched with pain, even in dreams, I wondered if I had saved her at all. Or if Thomas had destroyed her long before I pulled that trigger. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Rachel healed, at least on the outside. She threw herself into therapy, determined to reclaim her life. Caleb, too, slowly emerged from his shell, his laughter echoing through the house once more. But the specter of Thomas still hung over us, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. His trial loomed, a promise of reliving the nightmare in excruciating detail. The day I took the stand, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the Bible. But as I recounted that night, the terror, the violence, the sheer depravity of Thomas's actions, a strange calm settled over me. I looked him in the eye as I spoke, my voice unwavering. I wanted him to see the full extent of the damage he had wrought, the lives he had shattered in pursuit of his twisted obsession. In the end, the jury deliberated for mere hours, guilty on all counts. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. I watched as they led him away, his wrists and ankles shackled. He turned to look at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that took my breath away. "This isn't over," he hissed. I'll never stop fighting for my family. Never. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. They're not your family, Thomas. Not anymore. You lost that right the moment you raised your hand to Rachel. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind him, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. We were free. The years passed, the wounds slowly healing. Rachel met a kind, gentle man, one who showed her the love and respect she deserved. They married in a small, intimate ceremony, Caleb proudly walking her down the aisle. I watched, tears in my eyes as they exchanged vows. My heart swelled with a love so fierce it took my breath away. We had survived. We had triumphed. But even in the happiest of moments, the shadow of Thomas lingered. I knew he still obsessed, still plotted, even from behind prison walls. The letter came on a sunny Tuesday, years after the trial, a parole hearing, the board considering Thomas's release. I read the words with a growing sense of dread, the old fear rising in my throat. I attended the hearing, my heart in my mouth. Thomas sat before the board, his face a mask of contrition. He spoke of rehabilitation, of finding God, of wanting to make amends. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the truth. The same obsession, the same twisted hunger. He had not changed. He would never change. I took the stand, my voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. I spoke of the lives he had destroyed, the terror he had inflicted. I begged, pleaded for the board to see the monster behind the mask. In the end, they did. Parole denied. Thomas would remain behind bars, his obsession left to fester and rot. As I walked out of the hearing, Rachel and Caleb by my side, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had won, truly and finally. Thomas's obsession had consumed him, driven him to madness and despair, but it had not consumed us. We were survivors, a family, unbroken and unbreakable. And that, in the end, was the sweetest revenge of all.